There are 5 features of classical conditioning that you will learn about in this module. And the truth is that these 5 features sometimes can apply to other forms of learning. This just happens to be the module that they first appear in. So we'll go through them one at a time, but make sure you work with those practice questions so you can not only identify the definition, but you can also be able to pick them out in examples. So the first is stimulus generalization. This is when you respond in a similar way to a stimulus that is not the one you were conditioned to, but is similar to that stimulus. That's a little confusing, so let's give you an example. Throughout your life, when you're driving, you probably know that green light means go and red light means stop. If you don't know that, let me know what car you drive because I want to avoid you. But red light means stop, green light means go. Well, let's say you are the first car at a stoplight and you have a red light, and there's a car beside you in a turning lane and they have a red light too. And all of a sudden their green light comes on and they go. Even though that green light is not directly in front of you, most of you probably do what I do and let off the brake just a little bit before you realize, whoa, that's not my light, what am I doing? That's an example of stimulus generalization. You've been conditioned that a green light means let off that brake. But sometimes a stimulus that is similar to a green light in front of you, in this case a green light to your left or to your right, sometimes seeing a similar stimulus can evoke the same response. Hopefully not as strongly. I hope you don't just plow through a red light when you see a green light anywhere to your left or to your right. That's bad. But that's an example of stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is the second feature, and that's the opposite of generalization. This is when you can tell the difference between similar stimuli, and you only respond to the one you've been conditioned to. So, let's combine a few types of learning here, but if your car electrically shocked you if you let off the brake any time other than when a green light came on directly in front of you, eventually, I guarantee you, you would see green lights all over the place and you wouldn't budge until the one directly in front of you were to come on. So by telling the difference between these similar stimuli, you would have developed stimulus discrimination, and you'd only respond to the one that you were conditioned to respond to, not anything that's similar. Alright, the third one is extinction. Now, extinction applies to lots of forms of learning, but basically it is when behavior stops due to the removal of the association, whether it's due to the removal of reinforcement or the removal of 2 stimuli being combined. If we take Pavlov's dogs, for example, Pavlov's dogs were conditioned to salivate to a metronome because the metronome had been presented with food. Well, if over time Pavlov stopped presenting the metronome with the food, in other words, he just rang that metronome and gave him no food, and kept ringing the metronome and gave him no food, kept ringing the metronome and gave him no food, they would slowly stop their salivating until eventually they would stop it altogether because they had unlearned what they learned before. In other words, now the sound of that metronome doesn't mean food's on the way anymore. So that behavior would have been extinguished. Extinction would have occurred. The fourth feature of classical conditioning happens when extinction has occurred, but that response comes back just for a little bit, just to see if perhaps that association is still there. So let's say you haven't paired the metronome with food for weeks, and the dogs have stopped salivating, but all of a sudden they hear that bell, and they salivate just a little bit. That's called spontaneous recovery, and it's when the response that has previously been extinguished comes back for one or just a couple more last hurrahs, if you will, just to maybe see if the association is there. And then the final one is higher order conditioning. This is when you take a relationship that's been conditioned and you treat a conditioned stimulus as if it were an unconditioned stimulus. In other words, you have a conditioned stimulus that's so powerful, you can use it as if it naturally causes some behavior. So for example, Pavlov's dogs were classically conditioned to salivate whenever they heard a metronome. So after some time, hearing the metronome would make them salivate. Well, if you started pairing a red light with the metronome, so every time you played the metronome, you showed a red light, played the metronome, show a red light, play the metronome, show a red light. Eventually, you could get the salivation not even from the metronome, but from this new stimulus, this red light that you have paired with your conditioned stimulus. So higher order conditioning is just a fancy way of saying you're building on classical conditioning that's already happened. So those 5 features might be new to you. Remember, work with the definitions, but also be able to pick them out in any examples that you might see.